Hello students, this module attempts to critically analyze a poem titled Your World written by Georgia Douglas Johnson. So before we move on to the poem, here is a visual feast for you. What do you find on screen? Can you see the awesome beauty of nature depicted on screen? Imagine how it would look like in reality. Now look at this picture. You find a bed of flowers and trees around. Now look at this cascading of the waterfalls. They are trying to meander through the trees. Can you see that? Now look at this body of water. It looks like a small stream trying to assert its identity by flowing through the trees, isn't it? Oh my God! Look at these two small birds trying to befriend the zebra. Don't you feel that there is a kind of harmony, that we find among the animals? So as we look at the wonderful world around, we find a lot of creations. Right from the smallest of the small ant to the vast and deep ocean, we feel that everything silently proclaims the glory of God's grandeur, isn't it? Now what is this? This is a blade of grass. Can you see the 2 or 3 dewdrops on it? They look so green, very much alive. But what happens to this blade of grass in the evening or the next day? It withers or it even dies. But still, this blade of grass embodies the mighty works of God, isn't it? So in the same way, as literature students, we all know how the genre of poetry is something unique and incomparable, isn't it? I'm sure you will all accept what I say. And poetry, reading a poem is a beautiful experience because poetry rejuvenates and also ennobles our mind. Now, what could be the reason? Like the innumerable creations of God, poetry also declares the beauty of the world, isn't it? Of course, there are so many poems which deal with the crude and harsh realities of the world. That is different. But in general, poetry seems to declare the beauty of God, beauty of God's creation, and thus we understand the largeness of God's generosity for mankind. So, I'm sure it is not an exaggeration when we say that poetry will stand the test of time. Now, one such poem is Georgia Douglas Johnson's poem titled Your World. Now, a brief note on the writer. Georgia Douglas Johnson was an earliest African American playwright and poet who represented the Harlem Renaissance. What is Harlem Renaissance? Harlem Renaissance is actually a breakthrough or a turning point in the African American history, when a galaxy of writers, thinkers, intellects tried to assert black identity in a race-ridden white society. Now, Harlem Renaissance is actually multifaceted. It was an intellectual, artistic, cultural and political explosion which happened in Harlem, New York. Young World. The poem celebrates the liberation and also the freedom of the African American women who experienced the trauma of racial segregation. When the whole of the African American community was going through the painful process of slavery and racism, you find Georgia Douglas bouncing with energy and enthusiasm to look at the glorious side of life. And it is at this juncture she wants us to know what a beautiful world God has in reserve for each one of us. So Georgia Johnson used poetry not only as a vehicle to express her creativity, but she also inculcates certain concepts like freedom, liberation, hope against hopeless situations, unwavering optimism, and whatnot. So I am sure this poem is not just an address to the African American women. It has a universal appeal, and this poem will interest every individual who wishes to look at the colorful, fabulous, and glorious side of the world. Shall we read the poem? Your World by Georgia Douglas Johnson. Your world is as big as you make it. I know, for I used to abide in the narrowest nest in a corner, my wings pressing close to my side. But I sighted the distant horizon where the skyline encircled the sea, and I throbbed with a burning desire to travel this immensity. I batted the cordons around me and cradled my wings on the breeze, then soared to the utmost reaches with rapture, with power, and with ease. What a wonderful poem. It is very obvious that the writer has penned this verse out of her own experiences. What kind of experience? Not a very pleasant one. All bitter experiences. But in spite of that, she is able to rise above and fly like the bird. So that is a beautiful message that we find in the poem. Now look at the first line of the poem and come to the last line of the poem. So right from the first to the last line, we find the metaphor of a bird. The bird is flying higher and higher, trying to overlook all the obstacles around. And the first line of the poem is actually loaded with meaning. The writer makes it very clear that the world can become big and colorful only when we have the burning desire in each one of us to make it big and colorful. So one can feel defeated, depressed, and frustrated. So what? One should rise above all obstacles and see how big the world is. Now look at the bird in the first stanza. As long as the bird is inside its nest, it tries to accommodate itself within the small boundaries of the nest, isn't it? But the poet says the bird is able to look out of the nest and it sees the beautiful horizon, the distant horizon, where the skyline actually tries to enclose or surround the sea. What a beautiful sight, isn't it? So this beautiful sight should actually kindle the desire in each one of us to travel and explore this extremely large and great world. And we should tell everyone what God has kept in reserve for each of us. Am I right? So what happens when the desire starts burning? The bird slowly comes out of the cocoon. The bird sees the outside world. It is the horizon. The horizon looks so beautiful. And now the bird desires to come out of the cocoon. That is the cocoon of the nest. And it tells itself that it should venture the world. So the bird throws open its wings and begins to float in the air. And now what happens? Because of the determination and the desire that is so very strong in the bird feels that the atmospheric air becomes a beautiful cradle and it creates a very beautiful right ambience for the bird to fly. So with this good intention, it starts flying. Now how does it fly? Not with fear, not with apprehensions, not with a sense of reluctance. No, it flies through the air rapturously, extremely joyful. Rapture is the word used by the poet. And through that word, she has translated the joy that she has in her mind. Ultimately, the bird represents the poet. So now the poet has discovered its potential and it feels extremely comfortable. It is not going to bother about the obstacles that it would find on the way. But then the journey begins. So this is the meaning that is brought out. You all know that every poem has a denotative meaning and a connotative meaning as well. So what does the poem connote? Don't you think the bird represents, or it symbolizes, energy, enthusiasm, steadfastness, freedom, liberation? Oh, you have so many words. Perhaps the poet, being an African American woman, having experienced the tortures of slavery, through her art, she wants us also to join her. Where? To fly higher and higher, even when the barriers of the world, they try to pull us down. Okay, fine. We keep talking about freedom. Where does it begin? No doubt, freedom has its genesis in the mind of the individual. That is very, very obvious. What matters is the liberation of the mind. So each of us is created in the image of our own God, the Savior. So we are unique, isn't it? So there is no room for comparison. Don't talk about the color of the skin or the stature of an individual or how tall or how short one is. Why should we feel bogged down? The society will have umpteen number of parameters to gauge an individual. But let us not be bogged down by all these parameters. Let us bounce with energy and fly like the bird, break all barriers and desire to explore the world. What a beautiful poem. At the superficial level, it looks so very simple. But then if you read and reread and read between the lines, you will know what the writer is trying to tell the readers. Hope you understood. This is the bird trying to fly. Now, what is the limit? There is no limit. Eternity. So you can make your world as big. Your world is as big as you make it. I hope you understood how Georgia Douglas has created a big and beautiful world for herself by flying into the boundless realm of poetry. Don't you feel recharged and rejuvenated by the verse of Georgia? Come on, buck up. Make your world big. Thank you.